The grand hall of Luxara Prime gleamed with excessive opulence, crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than Marcus's annual salary, floors polished to mirror brightness, walls adorned with art celebrating Luxaran victories and aesthetic ideals. Sergeant Marcus Webb stood among the line of coalition officers being honored for their role as military advisors during the recent territorial conflict, and he felt deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. The Luxarans had won their war with human tactical support, and now they were celebrating in their traditional way, with ceremony, tribute, and the awarding of gifts to distinguished foreign allies. Marcus had read the briefing materials about this, but reading about ancient diplomatic customs and experiencing them were very different things. The Luxarans themselves were striking, humanoid enough to avoid uncanny valley effects, but distinctly alien in ways that marked them as something other than human. They were universally tall and slender, with those distinctive long ears that swept back elegantly from their skulls and served as both communication tools and status markers. The more elaborate the ear ornaments, the higher the social rank. But it wasn't just their natural physiology that defined them, it was what they'd done with it culturally. The Luxarans had elevated slenderness and physical perfection to an obsessive degree. Their fashion emphasized long lines and willowy grace. Their architecture seemed designed for beings who moved like dancers. Their entire aesthetic sensibility was built around a narrow definition of beauty that made even image-conscious human cultures seem tolerant by comparison. Marcus's commanding officer, Colonel Davidson, had been clear during the pre-ceremony briefing. This selection of honor is political theater. Each of you will be invited to choose one adult Luxaran as a ceremonial gift. They become part of your household, granted status and resources as a symbol of alliance. The practice has historical roots, but it's been modernized. You're not buying slaves, you're selecting honored guests who represent Luxaran human cooperation. Davidson had paused to make sure they were all paying attention. Choose someone from the noble families they're presenting, someone who reflects well on the coalition. Don't overthink this. Pick someone pretty who comes from a good family, smile for the cameras, and move on. This is about maintaining the alliance, not making philosophical statements. The ceremony began with speeches from Luxaran officials about friendship between peoples and the strength of their alliance. Marcus stood at attention and tried not to think about how uncomfortable his dress uniform was or how much he wanted this to be over. Then the selection began. 20 Luxaran women were brought onto the raised platform at the front of the grand hall. All adults. The briefing had been very clear about that, as Luxarans matured slightly faster than humans, and the coalition had strict policies about what constituted appropriate age for such ceremonies. All volunteers who understood the arrangement and had chosen to be candidates. Marcus studied them with the observational skills 15 years in the military had honed. 19 of the 20 were variations on the Luxaran ideal. Tall, slender to the point that human doctors would probably be concerned, moving with practiced grace that suggested either dance training or genetic advantage. They wore formal attire that showcased their status through elaborate designs and expensive materials. Their long ears were adorned with jewelry that marked them as nobility or high-status professionals. They positioned themselves on the platform with clear hierarchy, the most desirable candidates taking center positions, where they'd be most visible to the selecting officers. They smiled with practiced charm, displayed carefully rehearsed poses, and competed subtly for attention. The 20th woman stood at the far end of the platform, partially obscured by the others. She was different. Noticeably, dramatically different. Where the others were willowy, she was solidly built, not obese by human standards, but clearly carrying more weight than Luxaran aesthetic norms considered acceptable. Her face was rounder, her build broader, her entire body type fundamentally not conforming to what her culture valued. Her formal attire was simpler than the others, made of quality material but lacking the elaborate ornamentation that marked high status. Her ear jewelry was minimal, just small studs that suggested either lower nobility or someone who'd fallen from higher standing. But what struck Marcus most was her body language. Where the other candidates postured and preened, she held herself with careful stillness. Not the graceful poise of the others, but the deliberate invisibility of someone trying to take up as little space as possible. Her eyes were downcast, her shoulders slightly hunched, her entire posture radiating resignation. Marcus also noticed how the other candidates had positioned themselves to block her from view, how several observers in the crowd were whispering and pointing at her with barely concealed mockery, how she stood there accepting it with the weary endurance of someone who'd experienced this treatment many times before. He noticed the calluses on her hands, visible even at this distance, the muscular strength in her forearms that suggested physical labor, the intelligence in her eyes when she briefly looked up, processing the ceremony with understanding rather than hope. Lieutenant Hayes made his selection first, a tall noble whose family controlled mining operations. The crowd applauded politely. Commander Park chose a scholar whose research had military applications. More applause. Captain Morrison selected someone who managed interspecies trade negotiations. Then it was Marcus's turn. He stepped forward onto the platform, and the 19 candidates all shifted subtly, trying to catch his attention. Smiles brightened, poses adjusted, ear ornaments caught the light deliberately. The 20th woman didn't move. She'd clearly already written off any possibility of being chosen. Marcus walked past the first row of candidates, past the second, directly to the woman at the end who was trying so hard to be invisible. "You," he said clearly, looking directly at her. "I choose you." The grand hall fell silent so completely that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. The woman, he'd learned her name was Senna later, looked up with an expression of absolute shock. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The other candidates exchanged confused glances. Several looked offended, as if Marcus had just insulted them personally by choosing the one they'd all dismissed. The Luxaran ceremony coordinator, an elderly male with more ear ornaments than seemed physically comfortable, approached with careful diplomatic language. "Sergeant Webb, perhaps you would like to reconsider your selection. There are many distinguished candidates who—" "I've made my choice," Marcus interrupted, keeping his voice respectful but firm. "Her, the woman at the end." The coordinator looked pained. "That would be Senna Terran, if you're certain." "I'm certain." "Very well." The coordinator turned to Senna, who still hadn't moved. "Senna Terran, step forward to accept your selection." Senna moved through the other candidates with visible reluctance. They pulled back from her, subtly maintaining distance, as if her nonconformity might be contagious. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Confusion, mockery, speculation about what political statement the human was trying to make. Up close, Senna was younger than Marcus had initially thought, mid-20s probably, though alien aging was hard to gauge precisely. Her formal robe was well maintained despite its simplicity, showing attention to detail and care. Her eyes, when she finally met his briefly, held intelligence and confusion in equal measure. "Why?" she whispered in accented standard, quiet enough that only Marcus could hear over the crowd noise. "Why would you choose me?" Marcus answered honestly, though he'd only have seconds before ceremony protocol moved them along. "Because you needed choosing, and because I recognize strength when I see it." Senna stared at him like he'd just spoken in a language her translator couldn't parse. The ceremony continued with formal documentation, legal proceedings transferring Senna into Marcus's household as his honored guest and representative of the Luxaran Human Alliance. There were speeches about the bonds between peoples, ceremonial exchanges of gifts, and political theater that Marcus endured, while Senna stood beside him looking like she was waiting for the trap she was certain must exist. Throughout it all, Marcus could feel the weight of confused and disapproving stares. He'd just done something unexpected, and in diplomatic circles, unexpected was usually another word for problematic. Colonel Davidson pulled him aside the moment protocol allowed. "Webb, what the hell were you thinking? I told you to choose someone who reflects well on the coalition, not make some kind of statement about Luxaran beauty standards." "I chose someone who deserved to be chosen," Marcus said. "Someone who'd been overlooked and dismissed. That reflects coalition values better than playing along with a system that judges people solely on appearance." "That's not your call to make during a diplomatic ceremony." "Then maybe diplomatic ceremonies need better values," Marcus said, surprising himself with his own conviction. Davidson stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. "This is going to be a paperwork nightmare. But it's done now, so we'll deal with it. Just try not to cause any more diplomatic incidents, all right?" "Yes, sir." But Marcus knew, watching Senna stand uncertainly near the edge of the reception hall while other, selected, Luxarans mingled confidently with their new human households, that this incident was just beginning. And somehow, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Marcus's assigned quarters had been upgraded significantly now that he had a Luxaran household member. Apparently, the diplomatic corps assumed that selected individuals required more space and amenities. The new accommodations included separate sleeping areas, a common room large enough for small diplomatic gatherings, and furnishings that blended human and Luxaran aesthetic preferences with varying degrees of success. Senna arrived an hour after the ceremony, escorted by a Luxaran official who gave Marcus a formal bow that didn't quite hide his disapproval. She carried a single bag of belongings, and her body language screamed discomfort and wariness. "Thank you," Marcus told the official. "We'll be fine from here." The official left with visible relief at escaping an awkward situation. Marcus gestured to the seating area. "Please sit. We should talk." Senna sat with careful, controlled movements, the posture of someone who'd been trained to take up minimal space and draw minimal attention. Her hands folded in her lap, her eyes stayed mostly downcast, and everything about her screamed that she was preparing for the worst. "I should explain," she said quietly, "why you chose me, so you understand what you've done." "I'm listening," Marcus said, settling into a chair across from her. "You weren't briefed on all the candidates, were you? The other officers received detailed files. You were late to arrive from your previous assignment, so you only got the abbreviated version." Senna's voice carried the flat tone of someone reciting unpleasant facts. "The other 19 candidates are all nobility with significant political connections, or accomplished professionals whose selection would strengthen specific aspects of the alliance. I was included because," she paused, and something that might have been bitter humor crossed her face, "because my family once had status, and obligation required they include someone from our line. But everyone understood I was the undesirable option, the one there to make the others look better by comparison." "Undesirable by whose standards?" Marcus asked. Senna looked up, surprise flickering in her eyes before she controlled it. "By every standard that matters in Luxaran society. I'm fat." She used a Luxaran word that Marcus's translator struggled with before settling on something that meant aesthetically failed or shamefully corpulent. "I come from minor nobility with no resources or political power. I have skills, but they're practical ones that nobles are supposed to delegate to servants, not develop personally. I was included in the selection as an obligation, but no one expected anyone to actually choose me." "Then everyone's expectations were wrong," Marcus said bluntly. "I chose you because you were being dismissed and mocked for not fitting arbitrary standards. That felt wrong, so I chose differently." Senna stared at him like he was speaking nonsense. "You chose me out of pity." "I chose you out of recognition. There's a difference." Marcus leaned forward. "Senna, I've been a soldier for 15 years. I've learned to recognize strength that doesn't match official standards. The calluses on your hands tell me you've done physical work. The way you held yourself during that ceremony, enduring mockery with dignity, tells me you've survived circumstances that would have broken someone weaker. The intelligence in your eyes tells me you process and understand more than people give you credit for. That's not weakness. That's the opposite. In Luxaran culture, Senna said carefully, my body type indicates lack of discipline, inability to maintain proper aesthetic standards. It's considered a visible failure of self-control and adherence to ideals our society values. She paused. You've chosen someone who will be seen as reflecting poorly on you and on the coalition. The diplomatic consequences are less important than treating someone with basic human decency, Marcus interrupted. If my choice makes some people uncomfortable, that's their problem, not ours. And if the coalition has a problem with me choosing someone based on character rather than appearance, then I'm not sure I want to represent values I don't share. Senna was quiet for a long moment, processing. Most humans I've met share our aesthetic preferences. They prefer partners who are slender, who meet conventional beauty standards. You're the first who's looked at me and seen anything other than failure to conform. Maybe I'm just better at seeing what actually matters, Marcus suggested. But even as he said it, Marcus knew his own motivations were more complex than simple moral clarity. He'd chosen Senna partly out of genuine recognition of overlooked strength, partly out of anger at a system that casually dismissed someone valuable, and partly out of his own history, with being judged on appearance rather than capability. Marcus had grown up poor in a military family, worked his way through officer training on merit rather than connections, and spent years navigating upper-class military social circles that judged him for his rough edges and working-class background. He'd learned young that systems often valued appearance over substance, and he developed a reflexive distrust of societies that organized themselves around aesthetic hierarchies. Choosing Senna had been instinct more than calculation, seeing someone being treated the way he'd been treated in different contexts, and refusing to participate in that cruelty. What happens now? Senna asked quietly. The selection tradition is complicated. Technically, I'm part of your household, but the actual expectations vary depending on the relationship you want to establish. Some selections become romantic partnerships. Some are political alliances. Some are employer-employee relationships. What do you want from me? Honestly, Marcus said, I haven't thought that far ahead. I made an impulsive choice because it felt like the right thing to do. Now we figure out what works for both of us. But Senna, he made sure she was looking at him. You're not here to serve me. This isn't about ownership or obligation. You're an honored guest, according to the tradition's actual language. What that means practically is something we'll figure out together, but it starts with mutual respect and your autonomy being respected. Tears formed in Senna's eyes. She blinked them back quickly, but Marcus had seen them. No one has ever said anything like that to me before, that my autonomy matters, that I'm not just, her voice caught, just a disappointment who should be grateful for whatever scraps of dignity people are willing to give me. Then a lot of people have failed you, Marcus said quietly, and I'm sorry about that, but we're going to do this differently. Over the following days, they developed a careful coexistence. Senna took over administrative tasks for Marcus's household, not because he demanded it, but because she gravitated toward work and seemed uncomfortable with idleness. Marcus discovered quickly that she was remarkably competent at logistics, scheduling, and the complex diplomatic dance of Luxaran social obligations. You're overqualified for this, he told her one evening as she efficiently reorganized his schedule to accommodate 3 diplomatic functions he'd thought were impossible to fit in. This is administrative work that should have someone with formal training doing it. I have formal training, Senna said without looking up from her datapad. Lower nobility are educated in practical skills, logistics, resource management, administrative work. We're expected to manage households and coordinate social functions. I'm just finally being allowed to use skills I've had all along instead of being judged solely on whether I meet aesthetic standards. Why weren't you working in these fields before, if you're this competent? Because no one hires the fat noble, Senna said flatly. Luxaran professional culture is almost as appearance-focused as our social culture. I've applied for dozens of administrative positions. Everyone rejected me after the in-person interview, usually with some excuse about not being the right fit for our organization's image. She finally looked up, and there was old pain in her eyes. I volunteered for the selection because my family needed the small stipend they pay volunteers. I stood there for an hour expecting to be ignored, collected the payment, and went home. I never imagined anyone would actually choose me. Their loss is my gain, Marcus said, because you're making my life significantly easier, and I actually appreciate competence. Senna's expression shifted, surprise, then something that might have been cautious hope. You mean that? I don't say things I don't mean. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Marcus attended a diplomatic dinner where several Luxaran nobles made subtle comments about his unusual choice, an interesting statement about human aesthetic values. Senna, who'd accompanied him as part of his household, sat quietly and endured the mockery with the same resigned dignity he'd seen during the selection. Marcus waited until there was a lull in the conversation, then asked Senna directly, "What's your assessment of the logistics coordination for next month's trade summit? I know you've been reviewing the planning documents." Senna looked startled at being addressed publicly, then gathered herself. "The current plan has 3 critical bottlenecks that will cause delays. The primary issue is sequential processing of credential verification. If they'd parallelize the security checks across 4 stations instead of 2, throughput would increase by approximately 60%. Secondary issue is the catering coordination, which hasn't accounted for the fact that 3 of the visiting species have incompatible environmental requirements for food storage. Third issue is," she continued for 2 minutes, detailing problems and solutions with precision that made several of the Luxaran logistics coordinators at the table sit up and pay attention. When she finished, there was a moment of surprised silence. "That's actually a very good analysis," one of the coordinators admitted reluctantly. "We hadn't considered the parallel processing approach." "Because your planning team is focused on traditional protocols rather than efficiency optimization," Senna said, then seemed to catch herself. "I apologize if that was inappropriate." "No," Marcus interrupted. "That was competent analysis delivered clearly. Don't apologize for being good at your job." Later, a Luxaran noble approached Marcus privately. "You're training her to seem capable. Clever political theater to justify your controversial choice." "I'm not training her for anything," Marcus said firmly. "She's always been capable. You people just never bothered to notice because you were too busy judging her appearance. That says everything about your society's blind spots and nothing about her actual abilities." The noble looked uncomfortable and didn't pursue the conversation. But that interaction, and others like it, sparked something. Younger Luxarans who'd struggled with their society's rigid aesthetic expectations started approaching Senna with quiet questions and tentative conversations. She found herself, unexpectedly, becoming a symbol for those who didn't fit the traditional mold, proof that someone outside standard beauty norms could be valued and respected. Marcus watched this development with mixed feelings. He was glad Senna was finding community and recognition, but uncomfortable with how his impulsive choice had become a political statement larger than either of them intended. 4 months into their arrangement, Senna asked the question Marcus had been expecting. "What happens when your assignment ends? When you return to Earth? The selection tradition technically makes me part of your household permanently, but no one enforces that across species boundaries." "That's your choice," Marcus said immediately. "If you want to return to Luxaran society with whatever status and resources we can negotiate, I'll support that. If you want to come to Earth, I'll sponsor your immigration. If you want something else entirely, we'll figure it out together. But Senna, you're not stuck with me. You have options. You always have options." Senna's eyes filled with tears. The second time he'd seen her cry, and both times had been about being given choices. "Why are you so determined to give me autonomy, to treat me like I matter?" "Because you do matter," Marcus said. The formal complaint arrived 6 months after Marcus's selection, filed by a coalition of conservative Luxaran nobles. The document was lengthy, formal, and basically argued that Marcus's treatment of Senna, publicly respecting her opinions, including her in diplomatic discussions, treating her as an equal partner, violated the spirit of the selection tradition and insulted Luxaran cultural values. Colonel Davidson summoned Marcus to his office with an expression that suggested this was going to be unpleasant. "Webb, you've created a diplomatic incident." "I've treated someone with respect," Marcus corrected. "If that's considered an incident, the problem isn't with my behavior. The problem is that you're representing the coalition, and your actions reflect on all of us. The Luxaran government is formally requesting a review of your conduct." Davidson pushed the complaint document across his desk. "They're arguing that you've turned the selection ceremony into a political statement against their cultural values." Marcus read through the complaint with growing frustration. "They're upset because I chose someone they consider undesirable, and then I didn't treat her as lesser. That's what this is really about." "That may be true, but we still have to navigate it diplomatically. There will be a hearing, both coalition and Luxaran officials reviewing whether you acted appropriately. You'll need to testify, explain your actions, and probably accept some kind of reprimand to smooth things over politically." "I'm not apologizing for treating someone with dignity," Marcus said flatly. "I'm not asking you to apologize. I'm asking you to be politically smart about this. Give them something. Acknowledge that you could have been more sensitive to cultural differences. Commit to additional cultural training, whatever allows everyone to save face. Don't make this a fight about principles when diplomacy requires compromise." But when the review hearing convened 2 weeks later, Marcus found he couldn't compromise on this particular principle. The hearing took place in a formal chamber with both coalition and Luxaran officials serving as reviewers. Senna had been called to testify separately, and Marcus hadn't been allowed to speak with her beforehand, protocol designed to ensure independent testimony. The Luxaran nobles who'd filed the complaint presented their case first. Marcus had selected the least desirable candidate in what they interpreted as either mockery of their traditions or a deliberate political statement against Luxaran aesthetic values. He then treated her as an equal partner rather than maintaining appropriate hierarchy. He'd publicly highlighted her competencies in ways that embarrassed nobles who dismissed her. He'd essentially used the selection tradition as a platform to criticize Luxaran culture. "The selection of honor is a sacred tradition," the lead complainant argued. "It's meant to strengthen bonds between peoples through respectful engagement with our customs. Sergeant Webb has instead turned it into an opportunity to imply that our cultural values are wrong, that our aesthetic standards are invalid, that our treatment of those who don't conform is cruel. This is cultural imperialism, disguised as individual choice." Then it was Marcus's turn to testify. "I chose Senna Vastaran," he said clearly, "because she was standing on that platform being mocked and dismissed for not fitting arbitrary beauty standards, and that felt fundamentally wrong. I've treated her with respect because that's how you treat people, regardless of their appearance. And if recognizing someone's worth and dignity is considered inappropriate behavior, then yes, I'm guilty of violating expectations." One of the Luxaran reviewers, an elderly female with elaborate ear ornaments marking her high status, leaned forward. "Sergeant, do you believe Luxaran aesthetic values are invalid?" "I believe any value system that dismisses people's worth based on appearance is flawed," Marcus said. I'm not saying Luxarans can't have beauty standards or aesthetic preferences. I'm saying that when those preferences become the primary measure of whether someone deserves respect, dignity, and opportunity, you've created a system that's both cruel and wasteful. Wasteful, another reviewer asked. Senna is brilliant at logistics and administration. She has skills and competencies that could have been valuable to Luxaran society in dozens of roles. But she was excluded from opportunities because she doesn't fit your beauty ideal. That's not just cruel to her personally. It's a waste of talent your society can't afford. How many other capable people have you dismissed because they didn't meet aesthetic standards? How much potential have you squandered because appearance mattered more than ability? The hearing room was silent for a moment. Then one of the human reviewers spoke up. Sergeant Webb, do you understand that your choice has created political complications? That some of our Luxaran allies feel insulted by what they perceive as judgment of their culture? I understand that my choice made people uncomfortable, Marcus said. But I'm not going to apologize for recognizing someone's worth when everyone else had written her off. If that's politically complicated, then maybe we need to rethink what we're willing to compromise on for the sake of smooth diplomacy. They called Senna to testify next. Marcus wasn't allowed to watch, but he heard about it afterward from sympathetic coalition staffers who'd been in the room. Senna had been asked to describe her experience since the selection. She testified clearly and precisely about how Marcus had treated her with respect, given her autonomy, recognized her competencies, and never made her feel like property or an obligation. She'd explained her previous experiences with Luxaran society, the mockery, the exclusion, the constant message that she was insufficient. Then one of the reviewers had asked, "Do you believe Sergeant Webb chose you as a political statement against Luxaran culture?" Senna had been quiet for a moment before answering. "I believe he chose me because he recognized I deserved better than what your culture had given me. If that's political, it's only because treating someone with dignity shouldn't be remarkable, but in our society it is. The real question isn't why he chose me. It's why 19 other candidates were valued more highly based primarily on whether they were slender enough." The hearing deliberated for 3 days. Marcus spent the time expecting the worst, a reprimand, reassignment, possibly a diplomatic incident that would damage his career permanently. Instead, the ruling surprised everyone. The review board, consisting of both humans and Luxarans, including several younger Luxaran officials who'd been quietly pushing for cultural reform, determined that Marcus had acted within both the letter and spirit of diplomatic protocols. The selection tradition, they noted, allowed for individual choice in selection. Marcus had made his choice for reasons that aligned with coalition values of recognizing worth beyond appearance. His treatment of Senna had been respectful and appropriate. More significantly, the board issued a recommendation that the Luxaran government review the selection tradition itself to ensure it aligned with modern ethical standards and didn't perpetuate discrimination against those who didn't meet narrow aesthetic ideals. The ruling was a careful diplomatic document that tried to satisfy everyone while actually supporting Marcus's position. Conservative nobles were angry. Progressive Luxarans were cautiously pleased. The coalition considered it a successful navigation of a difficult situation, but the real impact was in the conversations the ruling sparked across Luxaran society. Senna found herself at the center of intense public attention. Young Luxarans who'd struggled with their culture's rigid standards reached out to her, sharing their own stories of exclusion and mockery. Media outlets requested interviews. Cultural commentators debated whether Luxaran aesthetic values needed to evolve. "I never wanted to be a symbol," Senna told Marcus one evening as they reviewed yet another interview request. "I just wanted to exist without constantly being told I'm not enough." "You're more than enough," Marcus said firmly. "And the fact that your society made you feel otherwise says everything about its flaws, nothing about yours." I know that intellectually now, Senna said. You've spent 6 months teaching me to believe in my own worth, but it's hard to unlearn 25 years of being told you're a disappointment, especially when half of society is still arguing that the old standards were correct, and you're just a human political statement. You're not a statement, you're a person who deserved better. Everything else is just people being uncomfortable about being called out for their cruelty. The cultural debate continued for months. Some Luxaran families began questioning whether their aesthetic obsessions had cost them talented members. Educational institutions started teaching more diverse perspectives on worth and value. The younger generation found voices they'd been afraid to use. It was slow, it was contested, but it was real change, sparked by one impulsive choice that Marcus had made for reasons even he didn't fully understand. A year after the selection, Senna was offered a position with the Luxaran diplomatic corps, not as a ceremonial figure, but as an actual logistics coordinator, using the skills she developed during years of being overlooked. She sat in their shared quarters with the official offer displayed on her datapad, and Marcus could see her processing the implications. They're offering me a real position, not a token role, but actual responsibility, because of my demonstrated competencies during this past year. You've earned it, Marcus said. You've been running my diplomatic schedule better than trained professionals. This is recognition of ability, not political favor. It's recognition that only came because you chose me first, because you made them see me as competent instead of just aesthetically failed. Senna looked up at him. If you hadn't chosen me that day, I'd still be back in my family's declining estate, applying for positions I'd never get, surviving on scraps of dignity. You changed my entire life. You changed your own life, Marcus corrected. I just gave you an opportunity. You're the one who proved yourself. Then thank you for the opportunity, for seeing worth where everyone else saw failure, for giving me a chance to be valued for what I can do instead of what I look like. 2 years after the selection, when Marcus's assignment was ending and he was preparing to return to Earth, Senna made her decision about her own future. I'm staying on Luxaran Prime, she told him. I thought about coming with you, starting fresh somewhere no one knows my history, but I realized that would be running from the fight that matters. Here I can help change the system that tried to break me. I can be proof that the standards were wrong, not the people they dismissed. Marcus felt unexpected sadness at the idea of leaving her behind, but he understood her reasoning. You'll do incredible things, you already have. Because you chose me when no one else would. Because you saw value where everyone else saw inadequacy. Because you treated me with respect when I'd been taught to expect mockery. Her voice was thick with emotion. You gave me back my dignity, Marcus. Everything I build from here starts with that foundation. You always had dignity, Marcus said gently. I just refused to participate in a system that tried to take it from you. 5 years after the selection that had shocked Luxaran high society, Marcus returned to Luxaran Prime on a diplomatic visit. The planet had changed in subtle but significant ways since his first assignment. The most obvious change was visible in the streets of the capital. More diversity in body types moving through public spaces, without the constant mockery and exclusion that had been standard when Marcus first arrived. The aesthetic standards hadn't disappeared. Luxaran still valued beauty and elegance, but the rigid insistence that only one body type could be valued had begun to crack. Senna met him at the diplomatic reception, and Marcus almost didn't recognize her. Not because her appearance had changed significantly. She was still solidly built, still outside traditional Luxaran beauty standards, but because she carried herself completely differently. The careful invisibility was gone, replaced by confident presence. She wore formal attire that wasn't trying to hide her body, but instead celebrated it with colors and designs that worked with her build rather than against it. Marcus, she said warmly, embracing him in the Luxaran fashion that he'd learned indicated deep respect and affection. It's good to see you. You look well. You look happy, Marcus observed. More than that, you look powerful. Senna laughed. I am powerful in ways I never imagined possible 5 years ago. Come, I want to show you what we've built. Over the next several days, Senna showed Marcus the changes that had rippled through Luxaran society from that one moment in the Grand Hall. She'd become a prominent advocate for cultural reform, using her position in the diplomatic corps to push for policies that protected those who didn't fit traditional aesthetic molds. We've established anti-discrimination protocols in professional hiring, she explained as they toured a government complex where Luxarans of various body types worked alongside each other. Employers can't reject candidates based solely on appearance anymore. They have to demonstrate that aesthetic requirements are genuinely necessary for the role. It's not perfect, but it's a start. She showed him educational programs that taught young Luxarans about diverse forms of worth and value. Media productions that featured protagonists who didn't fit the traditional beauty ideal. Support networks for those who'd experienced exclusion and mockery based on their appearance. The selection tradition itself has been reformed, Senna said. It's still practiced, but with protections ensuring volunteers understand their rights and that selection doesn't imply ownership. And candidates are evaluated on their actual qualifications and interests, not just whether they make the diplomatic corps look good aesthetically. This is remarkable, Marcus said honestly. I never imagined one choice could ripple outward like this. It wasn't just your choice, it was everything that followed. The way you treated me with respect, the way you defended that respect when challenged, the way you refused to apologize for recognizing someone's worth when everyone else had dismissed them. Senna paused at a window overlooking the city. You gave voice to something many Luxarans had felt but couldn't articulate. That our aesthetic obsession was costing us too much. Once you made that visible, we couldn't unsee it. Not everyone had embraced the changes. Marcus attended a formal dinner where several older nobles made pointed comments about the degradation of standards and the loss of what made Luxaran culture distinctive. But they made these comments more quietly than they would have 5 years ago, aware that public opinion had shifted enough that open mockery of those who didn't fit traditional molds was no longer socially acceptable. Marcus also noticed something else. Several of the young Luxarans serving in diplomatic and professional roles were people who wouldn't have been there 5 years ago. People whose body types, whose family backgrounds, whose overall presentation didn't match the old standards but whose competencies had earned them positions once closed to them. One of them, a young male working in trade negotiations, approached Marcus privately. Sergeant Webb, I wanted to thank you. 5 years ago, I was preparing to leave Luxara Prime because I couldn't find professional work here. I'm too heavy by our traditional standards, and no one would hire me despite my education. Then you chose Senna, and everything started changing. Now I have a career I'm good at, in a society that's finally starting to value ability over appearance. That came from what you started. I didn't start anything, Marcus said. I just made a choice that felt right. Senna and people like you did the hard work of building something better. You gave us permission to try, the young male said. Sometimes that's all people need. Someone with authority saying that the old standards were wrong and different is acceptable. You did that, it mattered. On Marcus's final evening on Luxara Prime, he and Senna sat together in a garden overlooking the city, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that had no Earth equivalent. I've been offered a position with the Coalition, Senna said quietly. Cultural liaison for Luxaran human relations based on Earth. They want someone who understands both cultures and can help navigate the remaining tensions around aesthetic values and cultural differences. That's a significant honor, Marcus observed. Will you take it? I'm considering it. Part of me wants to stay here, continue the work of reforming the culture that tried to break me. But another part thinks I could do more good helping humans and Luxarans understand each other better. She paused. What do you think I should do? I think you should do whatever feels right to you. You've spent years proving yourself here. You don't owe Luxaran society continued sacrifice if you want to try something different. Senna smiled. You're still giving me choices, still insisting I have autonomy. After 5 years, I'd think you'd have learned I can make decisions without your permission. I know you can. But I also know that people who spent years being told they didn't matter sometimes need reminders that their choices are theirs to make. Thank you for that. For 5 years of reminders of respect, of treating me like someone whose decisions mattered. Senna's expression grew serious. I've been thinking about writing something, a book maybe, or an extended essay. About what happened, what it meant, what changed. Not just the political reforms, but the personal transformation of going from someone's society dismissed to someone who helped change that society. You should write it, Marcus encouraged. Your story matters, and having it documented in your own words rather than filtered through diplomatic reports or cultural commentary would be valuable. Will you help? You were there for the beginning, for the moment that started everything. I'd want your perspective too. Of course, though my perspective is simpler than yours, I saw someone who deserved better and chose to do something about it. You're the one who built something meaningful from that moment. 10 years after the selection, Senna's book was published in both Luxaran and Standard. Chosen, one woman's journey from dismissed to valued became required reading in coalition diplomatic training programs and was widely discussed in Luxaran cultural debates. The book detailed Senna's experiences growing up in a society that constantly told her she was insufficient, her years of mockery and exclusion, the moment Marcus chose her, and how shocking it was to be selected when she'd expected nothing. The gradual process of learning to value herself when someone else finally valued her first. The work of transforming from someone surviving dismissal to someone actively changing the system that had tried to break her. But what resonated most with readers across both species was Senna's central argument. That strength comes in many forms, that worth exists beyond appearance, and that societies that judge people primarily on aesthetics are not just cruel but wasteful, throwing away talent and potential because it doesn't come in the expected package. 15 years after the selection, Marcus attended a ceremony on Luxaran Prime honoring those who'd contributed to cultural reform. Senna was being recognized for her decades of advocacy work, and she'd insisted that Marcus be there for it. None of this happens without that moment in the Grand Hall, she said in her acceptance speech. Without a human soldier who looked at me and saw worth when everyone else saw failure, who chose me for reasons no one expected, not out of pity or political calculation, but out of genuine recognition that I deserved better than what my society had given me. She looked directly at Marcus in the audience. He gave me an opportunity. I built a life from it. Together, we proved that one moment of choosing differently, of refusing to accept cruelty as normal, can ripple outward into genuine systemic change. That's the lesson I hope we carry forward. That every choice to recognize worth in unexpected places, to challenge standards that dismiss people unjustly, to treat someone with dignity when others would mock them, every one of those choices matters. Everyone can change a life, and sometimes change a culture. The ceremony concluded with presentations from young Luxarans, whose lives had been affected by the reforms, people who'd found opportunities, dignity, and acceptance in a society that was slowly learning to value people beyond appearance. Afterward, at a private reception, Marcus found himself surrounded by people wanting to thank him for a choice he'd made impulsively 15 years ago. He felt uncomfortable with the attention, with being credited for changes that so many others had worked to build. Senna rescued him, pulling him aside to a quieter corner. You never did get comfortable with being called a hero, did you? I'm not a hero. I just refuse to participate in something cruel. That should be the baseline for decent behavior, not something worth celebrating. And that's exactly why it matters, Senna said, because you genuinely don't see what you did as exceptional. You just saw someone who deserved better and acted on that recognition. But that simple act, that refusal to accept cruelty as normal, changed everything for me and for thousands of others who were struggling in a system that dismissed them. You changed things, Marcus corrected. I just opened a door. You opened a door I didn't know existed. You showed me I was worth more than my society had taught me. You gave me the foundation to build everything that followed. Senna took his hand in the Luxaran gesture of deep respect. Thank you, Marcus, for choosing me when no one else would, for seeing strength where everyone else saw weakness, for refusing to accept that appearance should matter more than character. You changed my life, and through that, helped change our culture. That matters more than you'll ever fully understand. 20 years after the selection, the story had become legend, taught in schools, referenced in cultural discussions, held up as an example of how individual choices made for the right reasons can catalyze profound change. The human who chose the fat alien woman for reasons no one expected. The choice that challenged cruelty, restored dignity, and changed the fate of someone the galaxy had dismissed. The proof that humanity's instinct to see worth beyond appearance, to value character over aesthetics, to recognize strength in unexpected forms, that these instincts could reshape entire cultures when applied with conviction and respect. Marcus retired from military service and spent his later years consulting on cross-cultural understanding, teaching diplomats about the importance of questioning, rather than accepting systems that create hierarchies based on appearance. Senna continued her advocacy work well into her later years, building networks that connected those who struggled with aesthetic standards across multiple species, proving that the issues Luxaran culture faced weren't unique, but were variations on a theme many societies needed to confront. And the 20 Luxarans who'd stood on that platform 15 years